Welcome to Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world and also covering the ACT, SAT, and CLT exams. I'm Tyler, founder of Achievable, and we have affordable ACT and CLT courses that include everything you need to ace your test. A full textbook, tons of review questions backed by our memory enhancing algorithm, videos on key topics, a built-in study planner, and full-length practice exams. You can get a free trial at achievable.me, and if you like it, use the code podcast to get 10% off. Now, let's get started. Today we've got Wendy Raynor with us, and Wendy, I'd love if you could introduce yourself.
So I am owner and lead tutor of WRH College Prep in the greater Atlanta metro area. We do SAT and ACT prep for neurodiverse teens and sit on the board of directors for the International Dyslexia Association of Georgia. And I run their teen board, which is a group of 54 dyslexic teens that like to spread awareness. And the reason I got into this is because I have my own neurodiversity, so understand the struggles of prepping for standardized tests when you have neurodiversities.
Yeah, and I'm excited to talk about this today. I mean, first off, you know, I guess just in this case, let's quickly define what you mean by neurodiversity for the sake of this episode.
I think the easiest thing for when we're talking about prepping for SAT, ACT, CLT, whatever exams, I would narrow it down to say, if you have approved accommodations, there's definitely some different things, but of course, any of the self-study tips can go for anyone who is really studying for it, who maybe is struggling a little bit more than normal on trying to achieve the scores that they're targeting.
No, that makes sense. And I mean, I think it's also just kind of anybody can probably benefit from these tips anyway, also, but these will definitely be, geared with a specific goal in
Mhm.
mind. And I think maybe let's start with just kind of like why don't the normal study plans and normal advice work for students that have neurodiversities? Because if they did, then we wouldn't be here, I guess.
Exactly. Because I think anybody who has experienced kind of that, when you have a diagnosed kind of learning difference or something like that, the way that you kind of approach situations or approach how you think are not always in line with the explanations given in the back of the textbook or the videos or something like that. And so it becomes a little bit harder to find the resources or really trying to decode how it is to replicate when you're doing the right answer. So I like to use my own. I fired, I think, 6 tutors when I was studying for the GMAT because they kept telling me, well, you didn't do it right. And I was like, well, I got the right answer here, but I didn't get the right answer on the same question over here. Like, help me decode, like, why, right?
Mhm.
And nobody would do that. And so a lot of times, when you're trying to self-study or something, you're just kind of in that same cycle of having that same feedback loop where it's like, well, I don't understand why I got it wrong. And so really how to
Mhm.
approach it a little bit differently um, is important. And knowing that you have a lot of different avenues and places to look is really important.
Yeah, well, and I think then, you mentioned just that there's a lot of ways to do things differently, but like, what are the core principles that you should be looking to implement, for a neurodiverse like student? What are the things that are the sort of common thread between these different methods?
So I think for my students in particular, I think one of the biggest things that's implemented that can be implemented in any self-study plan is there needs to be a set, absolutely dedicated time every single week that a student is only looking at standardized test work. It cannot be, the math on SAT cannot be studied at the same time that they're studying pre-calc. It takes a different kind of brain, and your approach might be slightly different on how you do the two. In your pre-calc class, you can't
Mhm.
practice the strategy of using your answer choices most of the time. Your teachers want to see the work. Whereas under a standardized test brain, you are going to use strategies like picking numbers or using your answer choices or things like that. And so really making sure that you're not mixing those signals and you're setting aside like designated time. Now, one of the important things that I know a lot of tutors, we've had a lot of discussions about this at conferences and everything, is I believe that that dedicated time needs to be no less than 2 hours. And the reason for
Mhm.
that is if you have extended time on any of these tests, it's a 3-hour test. Our students have
Mhm.
the attention span of TikTok. They, their
Mhm.
classes are 50 minutes maximum. So part of self-studying needs to be building the endurance to be able to pay attention and not peter out. And so I firmly believe that that self-study has to be in 2-hour blocks.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, so what I'm getting so far is like structure and also not like making sure that your brain is very like I'm studying for this now versus this in a different time and not mixing those two. And then also making sure that you're, focused on like essentially simulating the test environment, right? Like building the skills to do that. When you're, a parent with a child that has a neurodiversity, how can you kind of diagnose like what their strengths and weaknesses are with relation to like standardized testing, and then also kind of how once you've understood those strengths and weaknesses, like how you're going to approach structuring their study so that it's most effective for them.
So I think number one is parents need to realize that grades do not equal test scores. And so just because your kid has an A in pre-calc does not mean that they're going to get an 800 on the SAT math section. They don't equate. And so it's really important to use kind of like platforms like yours in that, that have
Mhm.
diagnostic tests and standardized tests and stuff like that, like practice to really be able to use that in the standardized testing environment to understand what they fundamentally know and don't. And, all of those mock test you have that broken down on there. So I think resources like that is super duper important. Once you use that to diagnose and you get those reports, then you can really start helping your child like dig in. But what you can do before even diagnosing, and I encourage all parents to do this, neurodiverse or not, is it's really reading is a lost art. And that's where most of our students really struggle in decoding the text. And even more
Mhm.
so when, you have kind of a neurodiversity on top of it. So really making reading and conversations about articles and really encouraging reading as a family is important. And what I mean by that is, it could be something in Sports Illustrated and there's an article and like really encouraging your child to read it and have a discussion about it in the car on the way to batting practice or whatever. But really kind of having those deeper conversations, taking it offline. I would love it if everybody read, The New Yorker, but let's start small.
Right. Well, and that's actually what I was going to go to next is like, it sounds like, you know, to put it another way, it's like, how do you get better at the SAT? Well, start by
Yeah.
reading, like reading articles, right? And it just feels like it's a little bit of a disconnect, but at the same time, it's like you're trying to kind of chunk this down into like manageable steps that you can then take and kind of continue to take, right? Can you talk more about that? Just like how, a parent can kind of take their identified goals and try to think about kind of how to get from here to there without overwhelming the student or making them suddenly on a strict military timetable.
I think number one, the first thing is take the flashcards and throw them out the window. Your child is not going to memorize vocab. It's just, especially if you have a neurodiversity, you're barking up the wrong tree. I've been so horrible about it on occasion. Like I had a family that kept having note cards, and eventually those note cards just happened to walk out of the house with me. So I'm like, please stop. But the note cards don't help, but having a lot of more less stressful conversations with your kid for those kinds of things. And then um, don't start at the hard stuff. You know, when we are talking about the students today, our rising juniors, so our class of 2027, we have to remember that they were COVID in fifth grade. And there's a lot of
Right.
fundamental information that they supposedly learned in fifth grade that I can guarantee you they do not. My students struggle with
Hmm.
PEMDAS. They don't even know the order to solve problems. So yes, they have an AM pre-calc, but that doesn't mean that they can solve a basic problem. And so as parents, the best thing that you can do, it almost seems, it's a little disheartening. I know, so many of my students, they're like, I'm in Calc BC, and I'm like, yes, but guess what? We're doing pre-algebra today because we need to really make sure that, we're going back. So pulling out the fourth grade, fifth grade textbook and having the kids work on that, it's pulling teeth sometimes, but it's going to be the biggest return on your, you know, studying investment.
Yeah, well, and standardized tests are about not getting easier things wrong, not about getting
For
really
things.
hard stuff correct, like most of the time. Or at least if you're a student that's an AP Cat BC, that's the perspective you could
Yeah.
have on it. I mean, one of the other things I also want to kind of dig in a little bit on some of these, like you mentioned a couple of tactics, right? How important is it to, yeah, and this is sort of trendy and part of why I want to talk about it because I feel like it might not necessarily be correct, but like how do you feel about like trying to have different types of modalities like visual, auditory, and even tactile for like learning things, or like doing like executive function coaching or like things like that? Like how does when it comes to studying for these standardized tests, like how much do these things actually help, or what are the things that you think are good versus maybe are worth skipping?
So we have to look at it in two different ways. I mean, if we're prepping for the standardized test, we're prepping for the standardized test. So will executive functioning necessarily help you? Well, the executive functioning to get you to study for the standardized test is going to help you. But if we're talking about kind of working memory, then yes, finding your process and getting that in place. So, like for instance, for a lot of my working memory students, like for grammar, it's I don't care, you are not to go, no change B, C, D, no change, you need to go after the period or the semicolon first. Like it's
Hmm.
changing the structure so that there's an order that they're always going to approach. And so, really working on the process that works for a student is really important on the standardized test. I think in life, like executive functioning, coaching, reading coaching, like all of that is going to help your student be successful in college. So, like, obviously, go do it. But for the purposes of SAT and ACT. Now, the other thing is that you must study in the format that the test is going to be in. So if you're taking the SAT, obviously you want your practice to be on the screen. That means that on the SAT, you can't write on the screen. So you can't be using your iPad and like writing on it, right? You have to learn
Right.
how to like put it down on paper. If you have dyscalculia or dyslexia, or you're going to run into problems translating it back and forth. You're going to miss a lot of math problems because you transcribed the numbers. Period. You're going to miss a ton of negatives. So you really have to be aware of why, not just like, oh, I didn't get it right. It's really tracking that. Do I think any student with dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia should be taking a digital test? No, I do not. I think they need to take paper, which means that their only option is the ACT. I'm very passionate about
Hmm.
that. But do I think pretty much anything else could be taking digital? Yes. And should they be taking the digital ACT? Hard no. If they're going to take digital, they should take the SAT. My passion about that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that all makes a ton of sense, right? And I think that it's important for really just for like the student to be able to kind of, I guess, just like have a plan and then do the plan, and then like that's like a standard thing that they practice, right? It's like, okay, for PEMDAS, I'm going to do it like this. For grammar questions, I'm going to do these things. I think just like, how do you kind of keep track of their progress in learning and implementing these like tools and tactics and things like that without adding a ton of pressure?
So I think self-studying error logs are incredibly important. When you're working with a tutor, I'm
Mhm.
keeping the error log in my head. Like I know what I need to poke. at with my student. But when
Mhm.
you're self-studying, you really have to keep an error log. How many questions did you miss a negative on? Did you transcribe that negative wrong? How many times did you do that? That means that you have to deep dive into that content. That does not mean that you should be going and doing another mock test. You
Mhm.
need to go and dig into the content for those particular types of problems until you're getting a bunch of them right. And you need to work in the progression of high yield topics, right? Like, our ones that we know are going to show up a lot, down to our low yield topics like, ellipses or advanced trig identities. Like those will show up once, but being able to PEMDAS a problem or move an equation around is going to show up 4 times at least. So, and really keeping track of their error log and then really hitting those top things until you get them right. And then once you are getting those right, then take another mock test and then see if you've cleaned it up and then start the process all over again. I mean, I can say with my students, especially when we're having to just really dig into deep topics, they won't, after they take their initial kind of diagnostic mock, and some of mine don't even do that because their neurodiversities are so extreme that I will say, we're going to pretend like you're starting at a 13 and just go from there. They might not
Mhm.
even see a mock test until 4 and 8 hours of tutoring because we really want
Mhm.
to make sure that we're hitting the high yield topics before we start putting it together again and then testing.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I mean, and how do you kind of build that process? I know it's like going to vary by individual student, but kind of how do you build that process, right? And maybe like how do you kind of think about the timeline that you're going to need to reach the goals that you have and what's realistic
So,
if your students neurodiverse?
I mean, I think I mean, I don't have an exact science for it. I know people have done studies on it and whatever, but kind of, I really feel like self-studying about 100 hours, including your mock tests, is where you probably would hit your sweet spot as far as improvements if you're studying it the right way, right? If you're just kind of
Hmm.
self-studying by just doing test after test after test after test, you're not even 100 hours is you're going to get a moderate if, you know, minimal improvement. But if you're really using that diligently, I can't see, I mean, I would think that would yield, it seems like a lot, but when I've kind of thought back it between my tutoring and mock tests and their homework, I get kind of backed up a little bit and I'm like, yeah, usually it takes about probably 60 hours between self-studying with and or the kids' homework and tutoring hours to get that beautiful result. So obviously it's going to take a little bit longer if you're self-studying. So that's always been kind of my click, I guess.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think it's just important to be realistic, right? Like these are not things that you can fix in a month
Right.
anyway, for the most part, right? But especially not if you're working with somebody that has challenges around
Right.
learning. That said, one of the things that I wonder about is like, I would imagine that the hard part is getting these concepts to stick with the student. And how can you tell when, you know, let's say basically like it's not working versus just it needs more time?
So when I have a student or, when there's kind of a block on process, I do like them to do color coded steps. So like with PEMDAS or something, like having each step a different color. And so when they're actually like doing their homework, the practice, not on the test, they're kind of doing the steps in different colors, trying to encode it and having a guide that they can follow and then easing off of it, right? So if you can do it
Hmm.
with a color and then you ease off of it and you can do it without the colors, or you can without your guide, but you can do it with the colors, great. And then if we can translate that to the test where you can't use different colors, like great. And so sometimes it's going to take a while to do that transition. Now, if you can't move from having the guide to not having the guide in a non-timed environment and you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, that's where we start having kind of there may be a bigger issue here. There may be something else going on. Because if you can do it with the guide, you do it enough times and then you try to do it on your own, something's not clicking, so we probably need to go back to the table and try a different thing. So maybe it's a different modality, maybe it's, you need to watch more videos or you need to have the audio steps. Like one of my students, I had to do a voice file and record it, and so he had to listen to me do the steps when he was doing his homework in order to make it. So then you have to kind of try the different things.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense as well. And just, yeah, at the end of the day, you're figuring it out, hopefully with some sort of professional guidance.
But do it
But
on
for
your
par
own if you're self-aware. I mean, it's just a matter of
yeah,
you got to try.
right. Yeah, and I mean, I think just to kind of to take us back to the origin of the episode, which is like study plan and creating that plan for your student, what's like the one thing that parents need to make sure to do to kind of make this whole process work, right?
You have to play a fine line, right? If you start asking your child to prep for the SAT their freshman year when they are in Algebra 1 or possibly geometry, because most neurodiverse students, I'm not going to say all, maybe, well, I wouldn't even say okay, 50% probably, are
Mhm.
just a little bit delayed on math. And so asking them to start actually studying and working with SAT material or working with ACT material or freshman year can be very disheartening. And the worst thing that you can do is, kind of create an environment where your student as a freshman is already thinking that this is difficult. So going
Mhm.
back to kind of, where we were talking about, fourth grade was when our kids were online learning. They didn't learn anything that year. So let's be real. And so the best thing that you can do for a parent is rather than focus on SAT or ACT or CLT prep freshman year, go get a remedial math tutor and have them redo fourth grade. Like
Right.
have them do that. That is going to be a huge investment in money, and they're going to be a lot stronger their junior year from a grades perspective too. They're going to have a much better foundation. I mean, I think, and that's the advice I give most of the families that call me that are very early. They're like, "What can I do?" I'm like, "Go find a really good math tutor. Go find a really good ELA tutor, and go back to fourth and fifth grade and just, find that elementary school teacher." And have them work with it. And your
Mhm.
your kid will probably be a little frustrated. I remember when I had to relearn phonics and all that stuff, like I cried every day on the way to tutoring. But, even with extreme dyslexia, by fifth grade, I was reading at a 12th grade level. I mean, you can get it remediated. It's just there are going to be tears. I mean, I still trauma.
It's still tough reading the New Yorker, right?
It's just trauma. It's fine. Get over it.
Yeah.
It really, but it was better. I understood it in the long run. It's just hard. So,
Yeah, well, and that's kind of the important thing is like at the end of the day, it sounds like building, it's partially up to the parent to kind of be like, no, this is like how the world works and this is what you need to do, even if the kid maybe doesn't want that. So what advice do you have along those lines of just like, how to kind of balance letting, your child who's kind of becoming, a teenager figure it out on their own versus like directing them or even enforcing what they need to be doing for their own benefit, but obviously I don't think they always
yeah,
want to.
I think a lot of it is scheduling together is, this is when you are going to do your tutor or like your self-study and holding them to it. It's not a nice thing
Hmm.
to do to tell your kid no, but you made the commitment that every Monday from 4:30 to 6:30, you are going to dedicate that time to this. Everybody has a family calendar now, so really making sure and holding the accountability. And that's really hard. I mean, I'm not dismissing it as a parent. It is excruciatingly hard, but really creating that calendar with them and then making them be accountable for it is huge. My students that do that are massively more successful than the ones who are allowed to change their schedule around and things like that. And then I think it's just being active, but really understanding that these tests are not the end all be all to their future. But if they want options, this is a big deal. I mean, and having those conversations again, it's getting the buy-in. The kids are older. Are starting to understand the cost of college and things like that. If you are not going to let them go out of state if they don't get a scholarship, then you need to be honest with them about it so that they can, again, have ownership of the process and understand what they need to do. And again, it's a hard thing as a parent, and it's a hard thing because every household is different. But I will say, with my experience and 15 years and all the kids that I've seen in all the different ways, the kids that are the most bought into the process are the kids that have schedules that they are bought into and that they understand the college process, the expectations from a financial standpoint, that if they want to go somewhere, they have to
Mhm.
get scholarships. This is the number they have to hit. And and those are the ones that the parents are not having to pound at all.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, maybe sort of the conclusion is make them be self-motivated, right? Because at the end of the day, you can tee them up perfectly, but if they're not going to do the work, then it's not going to
Well,
matter.
exactly. So that's exactly it.
Do you have any other comments on this topic before we wrap up?
No, I think really, using platforms, I think it's just really important to reiterate when self-studying, do not just use practice tests, like really use content so that you can dig in. So, like I was saying, like Achievable, like your platform, all of that stuff, like you really have to have content behind it, not just practice tests. And, you
Hmm.
have to be really diligent about owning your mistakes and not just like looking at the explanation video and being like, whatever, got it wrong. That was the right answer. So it's a lot of self-reflection. But every child, I mean, I was not a good standardized tester. I think the PSAT that I took my sophomore year, I think I got something around like 450 because I didn't like any of the answers in the reading section. But I've taken 90 tests at this point of my life. And so, I can get a
Hmm.
perfect score on pretty much any of them that I take other than the digital SAT because I'm dyslexic. And, you can do it. Anybody can do it. I'm not crazy intelligent. It just, the more work you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it.
Right, exactly. Well, thank you so much. This has been Shift, the college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Wendy Raynor from WRH College Prep. And you can get a free trial of Achievable's ACT and CLT courses by going to achievable.me.